Hello everybody, we are almost done. Since yesterday we have derived from the general concept of utility maximization and profit maximization, the labor and the capital market equilibrium, and then from this we concluded from the so-called Walras law that if we have an economy with fully competitive and functioning markets, especially with totally flexible prices, that then from the concept of general equilibrium, we can deduce that if almost all markets are in equilibrium, then the last market has to be automatically in equilibrium. And I think this I didn't mention yesterday. This is also similar to the concept of the circular flow, where you have the different sectors. Remember, government, household, enterprises, financial sector, and abroad. That then, in case that you have the condition that inflows equals outflows at 4 of these sectors, then also automatically you have that at the last 5th sector. It has also to be that there you have the condition fulfilled that inflows equals outflows. This is more or less the general concept which we have here also called Walras law. And this means also that especially since we have assumed that capital and labor are the main inputs for overall production, that then given this capital and labor inputs, that this determines total production, and that this is, so to speak, what is behind this vertical supply curve in the ASID model. And together with the demand model, we can then also determine the price level equilibrium in equilibrium. So, and the last thing we want to do is to develop a general model where we now, in order that I can present this in 2 dimensions and not even take it into the room in the 3rd dimension, we now focus mainly on the production factor of labor within an economy. And this is done in a so-called quadruple plot, and I will develop it with you together very slowly. In the end, you see a quite complicated diagram, but I think if we really start from the beginning, then you see how it evolves, and then hopefully you understand what it is behind. So again, we are starting from a supply-driven economy. So at first, we look at the framework. So what are our possible inputs for production? And here we are focusing that we have mainly labor as an input. You can also think about this from maybe a philosophical point of view, that also digging out the raw materials, gas, oil, and so on, which is capital. For this, of course, in the end, you also need labor. This is then maybe something like a view from Karl Marx in the 19th century, where he developed his concept. And although maybe his political ideas, we somehow can make a question mark behind it, but on the other hand, this guy was one of the best and famous economists, because what he has done in the 19th century, he really tried to describe the economy within this period of industrial revolution from a point of view where he went to the data. He really spent almost his whole time every day within the British Library to reading well how are producing the people in Great Britain. And so his famous work, Capital 1 and Capital 2, this is really a deep description of the economy. Later on, he also developed his political concepts. Well, this you have to judge by your own. But his pure description of this upcoming industrial society of UK, this was really, really good in these times. Okay, so labor, main production or main input of production. So what have I drawn here? I did something in a very compact way to fit, so to speak, the whole economy within one diagram. So let's have a look at first at the description at the axes. So downward, you find here L for labor. To the left-hand side, we find W over P equals omega. This is a real wage. So if we go back to yesterday, then here we have wages and we have labor. So it's more or less the same representation. So this quadrant here then represents only using another direction of the axis, but it also represents the labor market. Okay? And now within this quadrant, we want to draw labor supply and labor input. Well, what was labor supply? Labor supply was this increasing curve that the higher the wage rate, the higher is the labor supply. This means going now here in the wage rate to the left means we have to go down with the amount of labor. So labor supply will look like in this quadrant like this. Because now going downward to the left means if the wage rate is increasing, the labor input is increasing. Okay? So this is labor supply. And the other way around, going to the left and decreasing labor would be labor demand. So then this falling curve would be labor demand. Okay? So in the end, drawing it with upwards, as we have done it yesterday, wage rate, and to the right, labor input, this would be just a mirroring of this classical representation at this diagonal. Okay? We just flip the diagram to the downward left. So this determines an equilibrium real wage rate and, oops, let's do it like this. And an equilibrium labor input. Now we go to the right quadrant. Down here, what do we have here? Here we have labor, the input for production, and here we have Y, the output. Well, this we have also already seen. Let's go back. Here, this was the representation of production depending on the inputs of production. So in this representation, we have on the upward axis Y and on the right axis L. Well, how do we obtain our representation here? Just by turning this diagram 90 degrees to the right. You see this? If we take this 90 degrees to the right, then this turns on the axis to the right, and this turns downward, that we have on the downward axis L. Okay? So, and this, of course, then means that we also have to turn the graph of the production function 90 degrees to the right. So then, this would be our production function. Okay? The standard diagram, just turning 90 degrees to the right. So, and we have assumed that labor is the main input. So having the equilibrium labor input now, supply-driven economy means now that this level of labor input using the production function Y of L determines us also the production level. Turning to the right, onto the production function determines us the production level, and again, supply-driven view on the economy. This determines us the long run supply in our economy. So this is then also our supply function at the commodity market. So this is production. And now we go to the next quadrant here. And since I have already drawn this supply function, we also see here, there we have no problem because this is the standard representation, P on the vertical axis, quantity, production on the output on the horizontal axis. This is just our commodity market. So now we have our supply function, we need our demand function, and remember this demand function we have derived from the ISLM model, flexibilizing the price level. We have obtained the so-called AD, aggregated demand curve, and we have derived that this is falling in prices. And within this demand function, of course, we have this negative dependence on prices, and we had our parameters which are setting where do we find within this diagram the demand function. This was depending on the level of government expenditure and on the level of the aggregated monetary, the monetary aggregate capital M. So cut of demand and supply in the commodity market, of course, determines then the equilibrium price level. So now we are left with the left quadrant. Well, what do we have here? Here we have a direct dependence P on the vertical axis and to the left W over P. So what we are doing here is we have to draw just a function which is given by constant the the wage rate, the nominal wage rate over the variable itself. So what we have to draw here this would be, if we want to show it like you have seen it in school, that you have to draw just a function f of x is equal to a constant, let's call it c, times the variable, the inverse, just the inverse of the variable, times 1 over x. This is this 1 over p. And here to the right we have x. So how does a function, for example, 3 times 1 over x looks like? Pardon? If you go to the left, it's going upwards, yes. So I'm coming from here. And if I'm going to the right, what happens to this function? Let's see if the chat is saying something. I really recommend that you increase your mathematical competences. This is class 8, class 9. Yep, not a minus. 1 over a positive number is still a positive number. But if I increase x and dividing by an increasing, yes, it comes in the limit, it goes to 0. I'm dividing through a larger and larger and larger number. So if you always have to put such a function into your calculator, into Google or whatever, for example, you can just put it into Google. So where do we have it? Here. If you put here just 1 over x, hopefully this works. Let's see. There you have it. This is a so-called hyperbola. Of course, all these things you find in the internet, but some things you have to have in your mind because it takes too long. If you always have to ask your calculator or your handy or whatever, this takes definitely too long because then you are not possible. It is not possible for you to start to argue. Think of yourself. Somebody is asking you, well, you have participated in a theoretical course explaining macroeconomics. And in the discussion, you always have to say, well, let's wait, I have to type it into my handy. Or I have to talk to my handy and I have to wait, what is the output of my handy? Well, then I'm not talking to you, then I'm directly talking to the handy. And again, we are in the case, is artificial intelligence a substitute of you or is it a complement? Really keep this in mind. In my opinion, especially for economists, this will really change what we have to do in the future. Okay, so it's a hyperbola. It looks like this. And if now this number here increases, what does this mean? Let's say this is 3 over x. What does happens to this graph if this number increases? Yeah, it goes higher, it goes just outward, yeah? Because every number here on this graph has to be multiplied now with a larger number. So every number goes up, so then it looks like something like this. Let's say this is 5 over x. Okay, so then we know in general we have this hyperbola. And where do we find this hyperbola in this quadrant? Well, this is determined by the nominal equilibrium wage rate. And where do we find this nominal equilibrium wage rate? Well, of course, here at the cut of these two numbers, equilibrium price level and equilibrium real wage rate. So the hyperbola going through this point here is represented by the nominal wage rate as a parameter. Okay. So, and then this is the overall equilibrium in our economy. We have the equilibrium real wage rate, we have the equilibrium labor input, labor, we have the equilibrium production level, and we have the equilibrium price level. Overall equilibrium in the economy. Well, I think in this case, at this time, my drawings are quite good. But anyhow, I gave it you also here. This is the same. And well, then we have now a very general description of the whole economy. And as we have done it in the Keynesian commodity market, in the ISLM model, in the ASID model, we now also want to do economic policy within this model. So let's start with, let's do it in red, fiscal policy. What does fiscal policy mean? Starting from our equilibrium, fiscal policy means an increase of government expenditure. So plus delta G, larger than zero, of course. Again, as we have done it in all other models, the first step would be we have to identify the curves where we, so to speak, directly find government expenditure. When we have found this curve, we ask ourselves what happens to this curve, and then we will see what kind of impact this change has on the general equilibrium. So if you now look at this diagram, where do we directly find government expenditure? Yep. Yeah, top right. Yes. Here. Oh, I have written here production. Let's also write commodity market. Yep. And where? Because there we have two curves in the demand curve. Yes. So let's switch to red. Here we find G. Okay, this curve has been derived from the ISLM model. So now we have to ask ourselves what happens to this curve if this G is increasing. You can also go back into your slides because there we have already done this. When we have looked only in the short medium run ASID model. What has happened to this curve in the ASID model? There we have argued a little bit more careful. Stepwise here you can, so to speak, just use the result from this model, what in the end has happened to the AD curve. It has been shifted upwards, yes. So let's do it. An upward shift of YD, now depending on prices G plus delta G and M. So, and now we ask ourselves, well, does anything else happens here? Well, we have now a new cut between the aggregated demand function and this new, the aggregated supply function and the demand function. So at first we have also to ask ourselves, does now something happen to aggregate demand? Sorry, aggregate supply. I have to be a little bit more careful. Does something happen to the y-s curve? Yep. What would be the economic argumentation behind this? I just give you some money. We are now in this supply side driven economy. What have we assumed? Where is the supply coming from? If this in this view of the on the economy. The supply is coming from the general framework of the economy. How good are we educated? How good is our infrastructure? What kind of raw materials do we have here? And if my policy is now just to give you, maybe debt financed, to give everybody 100 euros, is then anything in the first step changing to your level of education? To the point, what kind of raw materials do we find? Has our infrastructure changed then? If I just hand over to everybody 100 euros? No, of course not. This is only a demand push. Of course, in the very long run, and this is what we hope what will happen. Today we have the debate in our parliament. Maybe tonight we don't have a government anymore if the young guys say no to our pension law. But at the first step, just increasing government expenditure doesn't change anything on the framework of the framework in the economy. So YS is still valid. Also, of course, this doesn't change anything within our preferences. We are still the same persons. So say labor supply is not changing. Also, the production possibilities of the firms are not changing. They have still the same machines. So labor demand is not changing. So here also nothing is changing. But we have now a new cut of the new demand curve and the old supply curve, and this determines for us now a new price level where we could think, okay, the firms are quite happy. They can now sell for higher prices. They are with rigid prices in general. especially in the labor market. We have assumed that this would be an incentive to increase supply. But why does this now not happen? Is not happening because we are assuming totally flexible prices. And this means, although we have still the same real wage rate in equilibrium, omega star, the people within the labor market, or we, the consumers, the workers, they see, well, now we have to pay higher prices. What is the argumentation? Well, we are working still in the same way as before. We want to buy the same goods as before. They are now more expensive. So what will I do? I'm going to my manager and saying, well, you have to increase my wage. Well, and this is what we see here now also within this diagram, because now we have a new cut of P star and omega star, representing an outward shift of this hyperbola. And the parameter for this hyperbola is now a new, this also P prime, a higher absolute wage rate. So overall, this means first outward shift of YD, new cut with the still valid YS curve. As a result, we have an increase in prices to P star prime larger than P star. And this will increase also nominal wages to W prime star larger than W star in such a way that the real wage W over P star equals omega star is still the same, W prime over P prime star, that the real wage is not changing. So the effect of this increase of government expenditure would be then that nothing to the real variables happens, but we obtain only a one-to-one adjustment of all prices in our economy. Compare this to the argument of dichotomy, which about this we have talked in the topic of money, when we have talked about the quantity theory of money. So compare this with the dichotomy. Well, and hopefully now you see how we have changed the view on the economy. We have started within the Keynesian commodity market. There we had assumed that prices are fixed. So an increase of government expenditure then has meant that the supply has to follow this new demand, and the adjustment of supply can only take place via increasing quantity, since prices could not adjust. But now we have turned to totally flexible prices. And think of the situation we just make to all our inhabitants a tax repayment. Then the enterprises know there is more income, more demand due to a higher income within the economy. What can we do now? Since prices are flexible, well, I can just absorb this additional income in the economy via an adjustment of prices. So in a Keynesian view, it would be a good idea because we can really push the economy via fiscal policy, while in this neoclassical view, we would say, well, the only thing what will happen is inflation. Okay, and then let's do also monetary policy. If m goes upward, so plus delta m, what happens? Again, we have to identify the curve where we find m. Yeah, a little bit louder. Pardon? Yes, here we have m. Again, we find it in the aggregated demand curve. What happens to the aggregated demand curve if m is increasing? Pardon? It also shifts outward. Yes. So let's shift it like this. This would be then yd of p plus g plus m plus delta m. Again, just printing money doesn't change anything in the framework of our economy. We are not more clever than before. We haven't repaired our highways. So again, total supply is still valid. We obtain this new cut. Our preferences didn't have changed. Our production possibilities haven't changed. So this labor market equilibrium doesn't change. But again, we have here this new cut, and also we obtain a new outward shift, and this is then represented, let's call this W double prime, and this then P star double prime. So again, outward, sorry. shift of YD. Well, and then the argumentation is totally the same as we have done this already, arguing within the fiscal policy argumentation. Again, what just happens in the economy is inflation. Yep, of course. Think of the aftermath in the financial crisis. Think also within Corona times. There we, in parallel, try to push the economy with fiscal policy and with monetary policy. We have done this, especially during the last 15 years. And of course, if we look at the data, in order to stabilize the economy via fiscal and monetary policy within the financial, within the euro crisis, within the corona crisis, all this has functioned. So this is then the hint that in the short run, it is quite okay to argue with somehow sticky prices, that you really can stabilize, that you in a little way can push the economy via increasing M and increasing G. But then, especially in 2021, in the end of 2021, it has started, and then in 2022, there we have really seen this huge adjustment of prices. And in my point of view, this was just the turning point where the argumentation, or the valid argumentation, what happens in the economy, switched from the Keynesian perspective to the neoclassical perspective. This doesn't mean that one of these theories is wrong, but in one period, it was a good way to describe the economy via a Keynesian view, and then in the other period, especially maybe the last 3 years, the neoclassical model is the better one. And this decision we always have to carefully made by us. And sometimes if I look at my colleagues, then I would say some of them, they are really fixed in their views. Well, the economy is always working like a Keynesian economy, or it is always working in a neoclassical way. In my point of view, it is a dynamic process. I really think if we wouldn't have intervened within the crises, then we would have been worse off compared to today. But also, I would say that thinking, and maybe we are right now somehow in this situation, especially in Germany, in the German economy, that we somehow think, well, since the stabilizing process has really good worked within the crisis of situation, that we still have only to push via monetary policy or to implement new programs, new fiscal programs, and then everything will work. Well, right now we see we are in the third row in the stagnation or even in the downturn of the economy. And there was also this study from the German Institute of Economy, and they said, well, almost 50% of our expenditures just go to consumption. And this would then mean that we just only pay ourselves. And I think it is quite clear that in the long run this cannot work. If you just go to the government and ask him, well, give me some money. We have to be innovative. And this is what you are doing. You are educating yourself. And hopefully you are the next generation with the new ideas. Otherwise, the cake will shrink. And if the cake shrinks, then I don't know if we still have a democracy here. Okay, so then that's it. Here I have also made this description of monetary and fiscal policy. And the last slide is then, well, how can we put these two in their recommendations? Somehow really opposite views on the economy. The one view says, well, you can always push the economy via fiscal and monetary policy. The other view says, well, don't do it. It creates only inflation. How can we put this together? Well, somehow we can then say that the Keynesian view is the more relevant in the short run to stabilize an economy for the next 6, maybe 12 months. This is possible, especially the labor markets are not adjusting that fast. But then I have to be careful if I really go on and on and on, that then prices will just react. And I have to be careful that if I go on with this policy for 2, 3, 4 years or something like this, that in the end I only create inflation and I'm later on worse off than before. So not Frist, this is again German in the long run. And hopefully after this lecture, you are able to judge for yourself. Since in 2, 3, 4 years, you are working in a company, maybe you are then in the management department. Something has happened to the general framework in Europe, in the world, maybe. I don't know what will happen to Mr. Trump. And then you have to judge, well, in which direction is the economy moving? And then we have to keep in mind, well, there is no true model. I would say there is always the best model within some period. And this is not really easy to judge. What is right now a good model? And maybe some times, like in capital markets, if you are in 51% of the cases are on the right side, then you will be a successful manager. If you are setting or you are betting in 51% of the cases on the right share, then you will be a very rich person. Yeah. Well, in this situation, my hope is that we really start also, now I'm talking about Germany especially, that we really directly start to fix our infrastructure. I take in quite often the railway. And if I have a meeting in Hanover or in Frankfurt, then right now, although I really love to take the railway because I can do much more things than sitting in a car. But right now it is the case that I really have to think, well, the meeting is at 11 o'clock. Is it really a good idea to take the railway? Will I be at 11 o'clock starting, let's say, 8 o'clock in Wilhelmshaven? Is it possible to be at 11 o'clock in Hanover? Right now I have to say no. And then I ask myself, well, shall I start at 5:30? In the end, then I take the car. And this would then for me mean that my production level decreases because I cannot do anything. Other persons are able to make phone calls and to be productive sitting in a car. I cannot do this. Also, we see this that we have a problem in our transportation system due to our bad infrastructure. And yeah, so for this, I really would think to increase government expenditure would be a good idea. Because then the argumentation would be that maybe already in 2, 3 years something changes in this, or not at YS, but at this with this production function. That this somehow bends outward. But unfortunately, I see in the discussions in the parliament that they somehow take these 500 trillion euros and they put it in other more consumptive sectors. And if we put this money just only in consumption, then I would argue in a neoclassical way, we obtain only price increases. And this would even worsen the situation. Because this we call then second round effects. This would then also mean if the prices will start to increase again to an inflation rate of 3, 4, 5%, that then the workers will again to rebargain and ask and say, well, you have to pay me higher wages. But higher wages again mean higher costs for the enterprises. Then they have to then they have a problem to make profits. So right now we are really in a very tough situation because we have also these global impacts from the United States and from China and of course from Russia. So we are really in a very hard situation right now. Okay. So, and to sum all this up, I brought you 3 pictures with some fishes. And maybe you ask yourself, well, what is this? How does this depend on economics in general? So first of all, maybe you can also look this up. These are the Latin names of these fishes. Maybe this one you directly know because there I didn't put the Latin name. And yeah, maybe let's start with the easiest one. What kind of fish is this? This is a shark. And where is a shark living? In the sea, especially in what kind of water? Deep water, cold, and do we find a shark within a lake? Yeah. Yes, this is a saltwater fish. What kind of fish is a salmotrutta? Has somebody looked it up? Pardon? Uh, oh, let me look up the English word because I'm also not totally right. And in English it is, oops, oops, what's the English name for it? A trout, yeah. Brown trout, you said. Where's a trout living? In the river, and compared to this, it is a sweetwater. And what is this? Yes. How is it directly called in English? Let's see. Flounder, yeah. Flou. And where is this fish living? Yes, also in the sea. Well, it's just living here, outside here. And what kind of water compared to these two do we have here? It is also salty, but it is somehow a mixture. Or this is just the mud here which we have where the rivers come into the sea, and there we have this mixture. And this is called, I think, water. Mixture of salt and sweet water. This one is just living in the mud. Well, what has this to do with economics? Well, let's go now to the United States. Maybe you know the so-called Ivy League universities. And then you have there some of these Ivy League universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and so on. Where are these universities are situated? Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Especially Boston, New York. So it's East Coast. So if we, let's take San Diego. So let's say this is United States. Then we have here Harvard, Yale, and so on. These here, and they are living at the East Coast. And there we find very famous economists like Joseph Stiglitz, like Paul Krugman, and so on, Nobel laureates, and they are more or less, yeah, they have a quite Keynesian view on the economy. Krugman, Stiglitz, and therefore, since they are situated at Princeton, at Harvard, and so on, this school of thought is then also called the saltwater economists. And then, especially here in the neighborhood of the Great Lakes, what is the largest city in the US situated at the Great Lakes? Hmm? This is Chicago. And Chicago University is very famous, especially some German or Austrian economists went in the beginning of the 20th century to Chicago. Mr. Schumpeter and Mr. Hayek. Hopefully, you have already heard about Schumpeter. Creative destruction. Have you talked about the concept of a market of creative destruction in your introductory courses? No, really not. Creative destruction. Well, from a philosophical point of view, this is what economics is about, a competition of ideas. And this, the market process or the market is so effective in producing new ideas, then they're competing at the market and only the best ideas are surviving. And he has developed this concept, Schumpeter. Hopefully, maybe you should read about him. Well, he then went to, during the very dark times in Germany, in the beginning of the 1930s, all our very clever, or most of the cleverest people of Germany left the country, and he went to Chicago, and also Mr. Hayek. He was also one of these very liberal economists who really relied on the power of markets. And they started, somehow this neoclassical school in Chicago, and later on there you find then also the famous American economists in Chicago. This is then Schumpeter, Hayek at the beginning, and then later on Samuelson. Oh, sorry, Friedman. I've talked about him when we have talked about quantity theory of money. And these are these then due to the Great Lakes, the Sweetwater economists, and they have this Keynesian view. Well, and so we would say then there, are you a Sweetwater economist or are you a saltwater economist? And I would say nothing of these two. I would say that I'm a somehow Blackwater economist. That this would be something in between. Or I also would then argue, well, the market also is a function of both, of demand and supply. And I would not really say that, well, supply is the first thing. Of course, especially in the Industrial Revolution, invention of more or less everyday new goods, the neoclassical view was quite okay. Then later on, take for example the Great Depression. There, the Keynesian view, John Maynard Keynes, then developed his point of view on the economy. And he argued then, well, the recommendations in the Great Depression from the neoclassical theory were totally wrong. Well, we have to admit that the first reaction in the Great Depression around 1929, 1930, that they really deepened the crisis. And maybe, or not maybe, this was of course one of the reasons very bad for our country and very bad for the world as a whole. That this deepening of the crisis then afforded the possibility of National Socialism in Germany, because the cake has really shrinked. The people in Germany around 1930, they had nothing to eat. And then you are following such a guy. Okay, so, but then we are done with the lecture. Well, then not today, but tomorrow we will start with a recapitulation and with some special tasks that you more or less know what you have to do in your little term paper. So I will just upload this and then we will talk the next tomorrow and the next week a little bit about these special tasks. So thank you very much and see you tomorrow.